So tourism and hospitality expert Lindiwe Sangweni Siddo has published her first book, The Syndicate of 22 Natives. The book opens a window into the life story of her father, the late Professor Stan Sangweni, into the past where when his grandfather, with the foresight and ingenuity, became part of the Syndicate of 22 Natives, a group of men and people that secured land for their families, including his family of 7 wives, for succeeding generations at the time when black people in South Africa were being systematically dispossessed of land. We are joined this morning by the author, Lindiwe Sangweni Siddo, and her close friend, Phola Mabizela-Mabaso, who is a businesswoman and former government official as well, to speak and have a conversation about the book. Ladies, a very good morning. Thank you so much for making time for us this morning.
Thank you so much, Aldrin.
Thank you.
I want to start off here, looking at those visuals that we are currently playing on the screen. If you look on this side, where does this take you back to, Lindiwe?
Oh yeah, so that's my father's memorial at the Bryanston Catholic Church of the Resurrection, and that is his simple coffin. He had asked that we have a pine coffin for him, and it's the Catholic Church which he loved so much, and that's my cousin Nomo Kumalo, and we're sitting in the front row, my mother, my aunt Lindiwe.
Yeah.
It was a sad time, obviously, but if you look at how sparsely filled the church is, it was also COVID.
Yeah.
And I still cannot get over the contrast of what funerals looked like then and what funerals look like.
Feels like a distant memory, eh?
It's a distant memory. If you look at Tito Mbeweni yesterday,
yeah,
his funeral was, attended by nearly 10,000 people in a stadium.
Yeah. And actually, speaking about Tito Mbeweni, that is going to take me to page 238 on the book. Because, so yesterday we were covering, of course, the funeral of Tito Mbeweni, and as he has expressed that he wants to be buried in his home village where he was born.
Yeah.
And on page 238, you make reference here to the wish that your father had. He wanted to be taken home to his grandfather, to Umkhulu Mgodeni's home on Suspense Farm. He was very specific. Please bury me in the community cemetery where my grandmother, Mandlesilo, is lying, where my mother, Winfredi Mkoko, is lying, where my father, Stephen Henry John Sangweni, is lying, where my uncle, Jerome Mfelo, is lying, where all my people are lying. That is where I would like to be laid to rest, at my home with my people. Why was that so significant for him? And how does that connect, for me, once again, the question about land and going back into the land?
It's a very emotional piece that you've selected. But at the heart of it was the importance of land and what it meant to my father and his people and to all the people of South Africa. So the book is very intentionally titled The Syndicate of 22 Natives, because my great-grandfather, my father's grandfather that he refers to, Mgodeni Kumalo, had the foresight with a group of other African men in a time just before the Land Act was implemented. This is now 1911. And they were approached by a very sharp gentleman called R.H. Kumalo to facilitate a group of individuals into becoming a syndicate. He had seen an opportunity. There was a white man selling some land, and it was a syndicate of 22 men who were then put together. The reference natives, of course, is not the way you and I are native, but the natives as in black people. Black people did not buy land in those days, but R.H. Kumalo, who was the facilitator of this, Mavuso Msimang's grandfather, was able to work out that if he was with his exempted status, in those days they were called amazemtiti, those people who had been already converted to the church, he had access, and he was now bringing in this group of men, so my great-grandfather became part of it. So this passage that you've read of my father reminding us and telling us, rather, instructing us where he wants to be buried, is so significant because that's where his life started. He grew up on that farm. Everything about that farm had his memories. The Tambo, the ancestors were laid there. And so he couldn't see himself going anywhere else except going back home, where he'd be reunited in spirit with his ancestors, but also to the land that was so emotionally a part of whom they were as his mother's people.
Yeah. And Phola, because now we're back at where he was born.
Right.
But then there's also the story of this matriarch that you want us to zoom into.
Yes.
And I know some people would be able to relate to this, and that is sometimes how there is a denial of a child. And I sometimes wonder what the psychological impact of that could be. But speak to us about why specifically that passage, as you read that passage.
Okay. Would you like me to read it out loud? So it's on page 7, and this is the point at which Uncle Stan's many mothers have brought his mother to Kwa Kambule Ukzobiga Isisu. So it goes as follows. In a barely audible voice, Mkoko replied, Umek Ubaba wengane. Mek is the father. After a long pause, Granny Esther turned her attention to the delegation and, not singling any one of them out, addressed the group. Mac is not here. We will find out if this allegation is true and we will come back to you. The Kambules never came back with any response. So I found that very telling because it's so taboo in our societies to have a child out of wedlock, and yet it is something that has happened from time immemorial. And the denial of this pregnancy was heartrending. This is a young woman who was forced to make this admission out loud among her mothers and the mother of the man who had impregnated her. And it was a moment of great shame for her. But Uncle Stan's circumstances were not bound by that beginning. He rose above those circumstances. But also for me, it's the manner in which the wives of Uncle Stan's grandfather rose in solidarity around this young woman, and they protected her from the rejection of the Kambule family. They stood up, they declined the scones and the tea, and that was their way of saying, we will not take anything from you if you cannot take this one so significant aspect, into your lives. So for me, the women are very proud in that moment, very dignified, and they tell a story about solidarity.
Yeah.
And I love that.
And do you want to add on that quickly?
No, I'm just enjoying that because, you would think that in a very traditional setting where women are often thought to be sort of like in the background, the women were actually leading this whole process of the identification of the fatherhood of this child, the paternity.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they had to come back with this, but the role that they were playing was such a significant role. And I just like that Phola has honed in on that.
Yeah. And I think also the other part around that is how, when Stan's mum and dad unfortunately passes on, how the family members now step in to take over. I think it was 14 or 15 years at the time. And they were able to still bring him up.
And that was such an important thing. He loved telling that story. He loved telling the story of his maternal home, his mother's people, who at a time where he always says, I should have been traumatized, which he was, they were able to buffer that trauma. So all his mother's sisters from the different 7 houses were his mothers. And they would literally, call him Umtaga Tatewetu and make sure he had everything he needed, if it was love, if it was food, if it was clothing. And they were not a rich community, but they had enough. And more than anything, they had a lot of love. But it also shows you how the village rises, isn't it? And that is the African story, how the village rises, how households may not necessarily have a mother and a father, but there is a community of individuals who take the responsibility of raising
Yeah.
a child or children.
Which is fascinating, because then he then takes on that role, and the sternness of what I want to provide for my children
Yes.
is available present dad, an available present mother, and the children being present, and even moving all around with you guys from various countries, Eswatini, I think there was Kenya as well.
Yes.
But Lusaka.
Lusaka.
Tell us about Lusaka. You were 8 to 9 years old at the time, and there were these figures that were coming to come and visit.
Yeah. So Lusaka was a wonderful time for us. It's one of my most memorable times as a child. I guess the age of 8 to 15, you are in your formative years. But it was also where my father and mother were exposed to not just the Zambian culture, but also the exile culture of the ANC and other liberation movements. President Kaunda, then president of Zambia, was very welcoming to all the liberation movements at a time that, you know, apartheid was, you know, the great oppressor of most of Southern Africa, and South Africa in particular. So this is where my father meets O.R. Tambo, Thabo Mbeki, Ruth Mompati, you know, the Nokwes, and many. The names are endless. And it's not, it was not even name dropping in those days. Those were just aunties and uncles who came in and out of our home. Yeah. But in the background, what was happening was the politicization of our parents and ourselves as children.
Did you understand what was happening at the time, that you had an O.R. Tambo that would be in your home and you guys would have to get up earlier, you and Dumi, to get ready so that your mom can clean the bathroom and make sure that once O.R. Tambo is up, he can find a clean bathroom? And also the story about the January 8th statement.
Yeah. So yes, we understood some. So O.R. Tambo's visits would be that our house was identified as a safe house. My father did not work for the ANC, and so he was, like many of the other families that were living in Lusaka, who did not necessarily, were not necessarily full-time ANC, provided safe houses. So because he was a wanted man, he could no longer just stay in any of the ANC residences. So it would be that our house became one of those safe houses, and we would be told very little. We would be woken up in the middle of the night and told we're moving into the parents' room because our bedrooms are going to be for security and for O.R. Tambo. And in the morning, there would be this wonderful gentleman, uncle, who would, you know, just hug and tell us, you know, how wonderful we were. But obviously, in the background, what was also happening, young children of the ANC, South African children, were being organized. We were called the Masupatsela ka Sisulu. And we were the pioneers, the youth pioneers. And we would go to an auntie's house called Rita Mfenyana. And there we would be taught about the Freedom Charter. We could, you know, declare, you know, we the people of South Africa hereby declare. We could repeat it, you know. We would meet O.R. Tambo. He would pop in. We would sing, we would dance and sing, you know, struggle songs. So we understood that there was a reason we couldn't go back to South Africa anymore. Our parents were no longer safe if they went back. But we also knew that the work of the ANC was to liberate South Africa alongside all the other liberation movements.
Phola, you grew up in exile as well. Did you understand that part?
I did, and very early on. We were in Swaziland, so we were on the front line, and being born in the 70s meant we encountered that influx of students around from 1974 onwards. So as children, we became very aware of things like security. We learned to check under cars for limpet mines. We learned to not talk to strangers, and also to identify cars that seemed to be following our father's car. So very early on, we just became very conscious.
So almost part of the intelligence structure.
You know, as,
like
as
right
little people.
In fact, Phola's father, Stan Mabizela, was an ANC operative in Swaziland. And her mother, Dixie Mabizela, worked for Barclays Bank.
Mommy worked for Barclays, yes.
So that created that facade that, you know, she was working as a normal individual. And our parents met up. So that is where also my father started getting the influence of what it meant to, you know, be a liberation fighter, ANC individual, that he had met Stanley Mabizela, Tim Maseko, and many others.
And this also then speaks about, so the reason that there are people who are in exile is that it's part of the struggle. It's another strategy that is being employed. But the end goal is we need freedom.
Right.
But freedom also that speaks to the public service that we would require at some end, at the end of the day. We just played an insert now of women who are digging up trenches. And I want you to go, Phola, to the excerpt that you want to read, because that speaks to the Public Service Commission and the work of the Public Service Commission, why that work is important. And I know that Professor Stan, according to one of the people that Lindiwe had interviewed, said that he wasn't happy that the Public Service Commission, which is as old as the ANC, was stripped of its powers under democratic state.
Yes, he was very unhappy about that. So this passage starts here. Sitting at the awards ceremony, he was being awarded a prize by the then Minister of the Public Service. Sitting at the awards ceremony, Lindy says, "My heart swelled with pride. The honors again stretched back to recognize the 50 years Stan Sangweni had dedicated to bettering the lives of people, first at SACUC in Swaziland as he helped establish cooperatives, then in his work with UNECA and UNEP, and then through his efforts to develop the School of Rural Development in Natal, and finally through his years in the PSC. This felt like the culmination of 51 years of insisting that the people come first, whether here in his beloved South Africa or elsewhere on the African continent." So Uncle Stan had dedicated his life to service, you know, and he insisted that all that was done in the name of the people should be upstanding. There should be no cutting of corners, and when services are to be delivered, they should be done so with integrity and within the requirements of the law. So his time at the public service, I think, was characterized by a great deal of putting in place the right rules. But towards the end of his time there, he became increasingly disenchanted with the manner in which there was an abuse of executive powers. He did not like the manner in which DGs, for example, did not have a strong tenure and were dependent on ministers. So he didn't want people to be abused because they were dependent in any way on government. And he loved being of service. He believed in providing to South Africans and people in the other parts of the continent where he worked what they were due. It was his entire life's efforts that this is what was due to the people of the African continent.
In fact, it was full circle for him. You know, this young rural boy who grows up in northern KZN, seeing the desperate lives of people in the rural areas without the irrigation, without the support that they should have to have successful farms. For him, this was a full circle moment to be able to say, every South African who desires to, you know, make something out of their land and grow and have some sort of income or even surplus should have that opportunity. And if there were impediments to public service delivery, this for him was just, it was unacceptable, especially if it was because of corruption or unethical behavior.
Unfortunately, because of running out of time, I'm going to quickly push this through. Ubaba, I spoke to you guys about it earlier on. So you make reference to it in the book. Ubaba versus Amazemtiti. Those are the exempted natives. And I was telling you about a lecture that was delivered by Professor Khumalo. And one of the things that came out of it was that while people think, and I also grew up in Soweto where I was told that Ubaba umuntu odoma, umuntu oyislima, umuntu ongafundanga, zonke lezinto lezi. But how Professor Khumalo positions it is that Ubaba actually is also a form of resistance. A form of resistance that says that this is who we are, we pride ourselves in who we are. And I look back at what happened during Stan's early years with his grandfather as well. And you fast forward it to your life, where Guzokokotwa, Sileta Amalobolo, Sizo negotiator. How do you then transverse what it means to Ubaikaba?
So Ubaikaba was a derogatory term. And it was really introduced because, you know, the colonizer was wanting to differentiate black people from white people and to say, if you didn't follow the Christian ways, you were a pagan. And if you wanted to stick to your customary tradition, you were actually resisting, as you say. It was a form of resistance and you did not want to conform to Christianity and so on. My father's grandfather was a stoic, traditional Zulu man with 7 wives. But he allowed all his 7 wives, if they wanted to be Catholic, to be Catholic. That was their prerogative. It therefore meant that intertwining the traditional ways was a comfortable thing for my father and mother. All the way till, yes, a man from Niger comes to Lobola at the gate in Wartekloof. You know, it was, and they were very serious. And Phola's father was there, a whole delegation of uncles and aunties to really stand up to say, Ugulobola, the traditional way, is our way. And it may be called Ubukaba, but we were dignified and African people way before the colonizer came.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for writing this book. Phola, who do you think should read this book?
I think it is a book for all families. For the young people, it's a way to understand our history with ease, because it's a very easy narrative to follow. For people of our generation and a bit younger, you know, it's also a way to hold on to our history. And for older people, it's a way to reminisce about how far we've come. You know, so it's beautiful. For families.
And we've come really far. And I have to say, and also the approach also that centers the family for me is quite important, because a lot of the time when we hear or listen to stories about the struggle, it is always the hardness of it, the difficulty of it. But sometimes there's that nuance of beauty that is there, the stories that we don't get to tell, and you've done that so beautifully.
Thank you so much.
Really
thank you for having us. Thank you.
Truly appreciate it. Phola, Lindiwe, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks
and have a beautiful Sunday further.
And to you too, Aldrin. Thanks so